Hello, everyone. It's great to be back, and I'm delighted to have with me Les Leopold, author of Runaway Inequality, who I will welcome in a moment or two and ask him to complete the introduction. But also, I'd just like to welcome everyone to this new series about the COVID spring, where we're just about to enter our first COVID winter. And I think it's really scary what's happening in the economy. We've got some task forces running, looking at that and trying to work out how we can use fintech and so on to alleviate some of the worst effects through the COVID winter. But really what this series is about is what happens next, where we go, how we build a better world. And what kind of world that needs to be to avoid us sinking planet Earth, and to avoid the huge societal problems that have been put under the microscope because they've flourished because of the impact of COVID, but also I believe there's been a flourishing of the ability and the willingness to address major societal problems. So I'd like to see this as a way of, linking into the opportunity. And I have to say, I was delighted to come across Les's book only very recently. I'm on catch up here because since the last crash, part of our story was the realization of the way the banking system works, and that it has created or turned the whole economy into a money-making machine that generates wealth for the wealthy, who extract that. It's really only in the last couple of years or so that I've been seeing people on this side of the pond in the UK, people like Professor Mariana Mazzucato and Kate Raworth grappling with this and bringing this realization into economics. But Les, it's so good to have you because you've been doing this for quite some time, and you're the one who's actually revealed the mechanisms how this works, and in the book you map it all out in exquisite detail. So we'll get into that in a moment or two, but first of all, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really am honored to be part of your series and that you connected with me across the pond like this.
Well, I'm delighted. Just by way of sort of background, I read the story. I haven't heard you tell it, so I'd like to hear it myself anyway, of how you started on this journey. I believe it was a question that you were asked by your son.
Yes, he was doing an internship where he had to go to New York City. We live in the suburbs. He had to go to New York City every day. And he was like stunned by the number of people that were just sleeping on the street that he had to kind of walk around. And he just asked me, he says, why are there so many homeless people? And I thought, by this point in my life, I really like writing. And I thought, oh, that's a terrific topic for another book. So I started to think about it. And as it was one of these questions that I didn't have a ready answer for him. But when I started to look at it, I couldn't get to an answer because it's a really difficult question when you think about how can the richest country in the history of the world have, tens of thousands of people sleeping on the street. What's the mechanism? And it wasn't that way when I was growing up. Yes, there were, basically in those days we called them hobos, but they in a way they weren't as down and out. They traveled from place to place, but there weren't just a lot of people sleeping on the street in subways and alleys, etc. So I had to do some work, and as I started to do it, one thing led to the other that led to the other. And I realized that the fundamental mechanisms of inequality in the United States, anyway, which is all I can really say I know something about, really was the driver not only for homelessness, but it actually connected many, many issues in the United States that tend to be viewed as separate. I mean, right now in the middle of the COVID crisis, you can hear all these separate, what we call, I'm calling like issue silos. You hear about food insecurity, right? You hear about, the racial injustice. You hear about the climate change. You hear about all kinds of labor problems. And most of these issues are viewed as separate. And as I explored my son's question, it turns out that they're connected. And the deep connections are the way in which, as you said in your introduction, the way economy is now designed to produce wealth for the wealthy. And that has really united all these what seem like disparate issues. So that's how I got into this part of the business.
Yeah.
Hopefully, and the goal is to try to share this information as widely as possible to see if we can't unite those silos somewhat.
Yeah, well, there certainly are parallels, and they're very strong parallels indeed. As I mentioned earlier, we've come to pretty much identical conclusions looking at from a UK perspective, that financial engineering and the banking system have been, turned into this machine. That to quote one of I think it was the guy who got the Nobel Prize for inventing financial engineering. Someone asked him what it does, and he kind of whispered in their ear, "It just moves the rents around." I think it does a bit more than that. And you actually describe how this works in Runaway Inequality, don't you? Would you just take us through that a bit? How does it work? How is it extracted?
I could try. I've just redesigned my presentation to go to, it's now Runaway Inequality, COVID-19 and racial justice, to try to show how the three big issues of the day are deeply connected. Where I start really is trying to figure out how it became a fact of life that the average working person, with what we call in the States, the non-supervisory and production worker, that's 85% of all the working people in the country. How come their wages, their real buying power, stopped going up with productivity in the late 1970s?
Yeah.
Right around the time when Thatcherism and then Reaganism and then basically the free market ideology, which we're now calling neoliberalism, kicks in. What happened? Why did the line productivity keeps going up dramatically in the United States? Like it's like a 45-degree angle from 1947 till today. But what happens with real wages is it's right on top of that line, and then it goes flat for a generation, actually even down a little bit. What happened? Well, it's not an obvious story. What happened was, in the 1970s in the United States, things were kind of a mess. We had unemployment and inflation rising at the same time, which was not supposed to happen under Keynesianism. And policy analysts and politicians were really at a loss of what to do. And a group of economists based around Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago had for years, since his entire life virtually, had been promoting the idea that the problem always is that government is in the way of the private sector. So the answer is pull the government out of the private sector as much as possible. And his idea caught on because nobody else really had an alternative idea at the time. And one key feature of his plan, was cutting taxes, privatizing public services, removing, welfare supports as much as possible so that people are hungry for work. But the other big piece was deregulation. At the time, deregulation in the States was, somewhat about the environment, somewhat about, occupational safety and health. It was really about reducing the power of unions, because that's a regulation that's inside of, at that point, at least a quarter of the factories and businesses in the United States, and reducing their power would be a good thing for business. We were told. But what happened was the financial sector in the United States had been a sleepy backwater since 1935, roughly, at the point where they were blamed for the Great Depression in the United States. And so the regulation on the financial sector was incredibly severe. So severe that the wage at virtually any level in the financial sector was no different than in the rest of the private sector. It didn't matter whether you worked for a big bank or an auto firm, given your skill, experience, et cetera, you got paid about the same. Maybe banking hours were a little bit less severe. So you couldn't really make big money in the financial sector. Well, when they saw this trend towards deregulation, the group that we at that time we started to call corporate raiders. Now we have nice names for them: hedge funds, private equity companies. They started to blow through this deregulation and get rule changes. One of the biggest rule changes they got was on stock buybacks and on being able to buy up companies with borrowed money. Leveraged buyouts. Those two things came together in an incredibly powerful and long-term pernicious way. Up until 1982, no company could spend more than 2% of its profits on stock buybacks. Now, stock buybacks, for the uninitiated, are an incredibly easy way to raise the price of the stock. Before 1982, it meant that it was taking the company's money, going into the stock market and buying back the company's own shares, thereby reducing the number of shares, each share being more valuable, and bidding up the price to get people to sell them to you. And so if you own those stocks, it was a great way to raise the price. And before 1982, this was called stock manipulation, right? That's why they had a 2% cap on it. Today in the States, it's 70%. 70% of corporate profits go to stock buybacks, 70%. And it's fair to say that today, the business of America's business is stock buybacks, because the other thing that changed, well, two steps here. Companies were being bought up by the thousands by corporate raiders, and then with borrowed money. And then they would take the debt and put it on top of the corporation so that the corporate raider didn't have to take on the liability. And then they'd want to suck up as much money out of the corporation as possible. And the best way to do that was to pay the executives with stock incentives and then have the whole crew work on stock buybacks, because now the corporate raider had the stock, the corporate executives had the stock. And so the goal was, forget about other stakeholders, forget about society, raise the price of the stock through stock buybacks. That became the only thing anybody cared about, because now corporate executives used to get about 5% of their pay in stocks. As this transition took place in the 1980s, their pay jumped up to 85% of their pay was through stock incentives and stock options, et cetera. So this is all they cared about. And this became, it became so wild. Let me give you an example of how crazy it's become. The Trump administration passed a $1.1 trillion tax cut for corporations, reducing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Where did the money go? It was supposed to go to create new jobs in America and increase workers' wages on the average of $4,000 a worker across the country.
Yeah.
Of that $1.1 trillion, 98% of it went to stock buybacks.
So can I just press pause there for a second? Because
Sure.
I didn't, I came across this mechanism of stock buybacks actually originally via Mariana Mazzucato's book, from the professor from UCL, and didn't quite understand it until I read Runaway Inequality. And let me tell me if this is about right. So this is a mechanism where a financial engineer, a bank, a hedge fund, or whoever can come along and in effect form a cabal with the management and owners of a company to engineer, to extract value, so to replace the value in the company with borrowing.
All right, let's start this way. Let's start with even though the company it's a good one to start with, actually. Let's start with Hertz Rent-A-Car. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in the States, a lot of people buy cars with car loans.
Yeah.
Right. So I ask people when I have them raise their hand if they ever bought a car with a car loan, and I'm doing this in trade unions, and many of them have. And so I say, who pays back the loan, you or the car? And they laugh. Of course, I have to pay it back. Well, I said, you made a mistake. You should have bought Hertz Rent-A-Car. Because if you borrowed, 95% of the money to buy Hertz Rent-A-Car, you can have Hertz Rent-A-Car pay back the loan. You put the loan, if you're the successful bidder, if you're the hedge fund or private equity company, the corporate raider that buys Hertz, and you borrowed all this money to buy Hertz, you make Hertz pay it back. Okay, so now you own Hertz. First thing you do is you get Hertz to give you back a special dividend, and that takes care of your down payment, because you now own Hertz. You can do whatever you want with it. Now, the existing management, you may not want them there, but you're going to change the way they function. So you're going to put in your own people, or you're going to put in some new people, use the old people, but you're going to change the way they get paid. So now they're going to get paid in the value of Hertz stock.
In other words, they're going to get cut in, right?
Yeah. Well, they're unless they're philanthropists, they can't make any money at all, really, unless the stock price goes up, because now they're getting paid 85% of their pay on average is going to be stock incentives and stock buybacks. So when they go to work every day, they try, their limo takes them to work every day. What do you think they're thinking about? They're thinking about, how do I pump up the stock of Hertz Rent-A-Car? So that's all they care about. So how do you do that? Well, imagine that, Barry, you and I own $1 million corporation, has two shares, equal shares. Yours is worth 500,000, right? Mine is worth 500,000. Now, in your wisdom, you decide, you know what? I'm going to buy out less. I'm going to borrow some money someplace, or I have some savings. So you're going to buy me out. Now, by law, when you buy out my share, that share disappears. Mm-hmm. So now there's one share left. Before, there were two shares that were worth $500,000 each. Now there's one share left. It's worth $1 million, right? So by doing a stock buyback, you've increased the value of the share, because it's like, one less owner. Yep. And this works out with millions of shares. The earnings per share goes up automatically when you reduce the number of shares by millions of shares through your stock buyback. And also, I could have said, Barry, I know my share is worth $500,000, but you know what? I don't want to sell it. So you start saying, I'll give you 510, I'll give you 520, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to bid up the price a little bit to get me to sell. Yeah. So those two forces guarantee that as soon as the corporation declares a stock buyback, they will then be able to drive up the price of the share. And if they time it just right, And of course, they will time it just right. They can start cashing out their stock buybacks, and the private equity company can start selling. And lo and behold, this is the extraction method. So how do you do this? You have to do a stock buyback, you have to squeeze the company to get as much cash flow as possible. So everything you can imagine, they do. They move to low wage areas. They cut down the pension funds, the health and safety, the R&D, the wages and benefits. They do everything they can to extract more money, not because they're going to reinvest it in some productive way. They're going to do it to extract it, to put it into their pockets at the top and their pockets in the private equity companies. Now, remember, the private equity companies are buying up dozens of these companies and doing the same thing again and again and again. And the loans are stuck on the company. Now, what happens at some point, and this is what's happened to Toys R Us in America and all kinds of stores, they get loaded up with so much debt through this process that eventually they just collapse and they go under. But by then, the chief executives have milked it, the corporate raiders have milked it, and they're on to something else. And then the society steps back and say, oh, isn't this unfortunate that they weren't able to compete? And it's just the laws of capitalism. This is an incredibly pernicious process. Let me add one more thing. There are thousands of companies in the United States. I can't say for sure this happens in Britain. Thousands of companies that spend more than 100% of their profits on stock buybacks. More than 100%. How do they do it? They borrow more money and stick the debt onto their own corporations. So this is the game. And you can keep doing this until you get a lot of collapses.
And this is value extraction. This is
perfect.
Both yes. Came up independently with the term financial strip mining. Incidentally, it turns out we've been talking about that for quite some time. I know something that you've used. But to take you on a really simple example, it wasn't me that went and borrowed the £500,000 or £600,000 to buy your share back. I got the company to do that, didn't I?
Well, yes, exactly. You stuck the debt onto the company.
Yeah. So the company's now indebted, and I've got twice as many shares, or I've got one share that's worth the whole company. That is some sleight of hand.
Well, it's a lovely process, yes, and we're all addicted to it in the States because. Let me give you one more example that really, really galled me, and this took place. As you may recall, General Motors was about to go under during the big recession, the Great Recession. And the government came in and did a rescue. And in the process of that rescue, the union had to take an enormous cut, and they had to agree to a 2-tier wage. Yeah. The new employees would get half as much as the old employees, et cetera. And the company survived. Now, there was a committee that was engineering this buyout, the bailout, to support General Motors. And one of the guys on that committee got put together a couple of hedge funds. And after this all took place, General Motors got on its feet again and had about a $25 billion profit, started to build up some cash. Now, all of us thought at the time that, oh my God, we bailed out General Motors. We expect them to invest heavily now into green energy cars, electric cars, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's not quite what happened. What happened was that the guy who was on the committee for the government, right, who helped engineer the bailout, went and his little group bought up a large number of General Motors shares, right? He understood General Motors better than anybody in the whole country, virtually. And they then, when the cash flow built up, they demanded and received a $5 billion stock buyback. Price of the stock went up. They made something like $1 billion of profit the guy who was working for the government his crew makes $1 billion, and $5 billion disappears from the books of General Motors. Poof, gone. And plants got shut down and all this kind of other stuff happened. The whole idea of multiple stakeholders didn't exist for General Motors, doesn't exist for any of these companies. This happens again and again and again. I can give you example after example of companies just milking their own company to satisfy. Sometimes it's a herd of private equity companies and hedge funds that jump on a company at the same time, like 50 of them. And then they'll buy up so many shares that they can just walk into the board meeting and say, look, we're going to replace you all unless you do the stock buyback.
Yeah. So this is financialization we're talking about, isn't it?
Oh, God, yeah.
This is fairly easily traceable, tell me if I'm wrong, to the philosophy that was embodied in Milton Friedman, if not him himself. How did it become acceptable, do you think? Because before, I can remember the time when the whole concept of let's talk also about the huge inequality in terms of, pay, CEO pay, in a moment or two as well. But the idea of a government employee or someone acting on behalf of the government profiting by $100,000 or $1 million or pounds would have been unthinkable not so very long ago, certainly in my lifetime. How did we get here?
That's a terrific question. And it's one of the most perplexing ones that I think we've all had to grapple with. There was such fatigue, at least in the States during the 70s, and I think there was some of this as well in Britain, with the Keynesian social. And here's what happened in the States: the social democratic Keynesian model collapses under the weight of the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. At least this is what it was impossible to do guns and butter at the same time, and the various Keynesian mechanisms that should have been put in place to stop inflation early on didn't work. They didn't do them because they wanted to hide. They didn't want to have a tax increase to pay for the war, and the economy was super heated up. And plus in the States, we were spending money on 800, 900 military bases around the world. We were really pushing the envelope on trying to, govern the whole world. And it led to this combination of inflation and rising unemployment at the same time. So the notion that the other thing that was going on was a social revolution of sorts, where young people, I was one of them at the time, were rejecting the idea of profiteering, that the idea of a corporate, that all that mattered in life was profits and making money, was being kind of rejected. And there were more, radical and even violent versions of this. 4,000 banks got blown up during the because of, these were anti-war demonstrations that were going on. So there was a lot of unrest, and the idea on the corporate side was to kind of get control of this again. And the Friedman path was the path of least resistance, because they weren't going to be able to increase taxes on everybody any more than they already had. There had been tax revolts going on. They didn't have a good social democratic vision. The Treasury was, tapped. This full-scale raging war was still going on all the way till 1975, really. You had this mistrust of government that was growing because of the Nixon, Watergate, and the whole impeachment thing. You had two tremendous attacks on government. One was the lying around the Vietnam War, and you had 500,000 young people over there at one point, and millions more being drafted, et cetera, and being lied to about what was going on, why we were there, how it was going, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had Nixon, the president, lying to you. So the faith in the government went from a high of like 75% approval during the Kennedy administration, collapses down to like, keeps going down, 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 down. So there was a mistrust of government. And the idea of the private sector sort of taking over became very appealing. The negative side of this didn't appear for a long time. In other words, trickle down seemed to be working. And what really worked were a whole lot of people got rich. So now you have people in finance, people at the top of industry. You start seeing higher, as the internet media thing starts growing, you start seeing political people getting access to more money. The idea that, and here's the big transformation I think that takes place. I can't tell you if there was a flip or if it was how gradual this was, but the idea of you being in government was almost like saying you were a loser. Yeah. If you were so smart, why weren't you at the beginning working for the high-tech industry or finance? The money, being an investment banker. I remember when I was in grad school, there was one a fellow student, this one woman wanted to be an investment banker. And the rest of us looked at her like she was from Mars, right? But she was in the vanguard. The idea now, if you're smart, why are you doing this public service stuff? You're going to make, pennies. You could be making millions. Why aren't you using your brain to go where the money is? And there was this flip to, making money was more important than public service because the government was a mess anyway. What were you doing there? So that turnaround, I think, affected huge numbers of people. And it got worse and worse and worse as more money. Now you start seeing media people making a lot of money. You'd write books and you'd make a lot of money. You'd have, your talk shows, everybody was making a lot of money at that top. First of all, the top fraction of the top 1% are making billions. And the next 5% are doing very, very, very well. And they are kind of controlling the conversation. But what was building up underneath it, and you see it with Brexit, we see it with Trump, were all these people that were being left behind, looked at the two-party system and said, you know what, the Democrats are as bad. In our case, the Democrats are as hungry for money at our expense as anybody else. They're not doing anything for us. Our jobs are disappearing. Our wages are going down. Our kids are living at home now. They can't find employment. Our own towns are turning into kind of ghost towns. And they start rebelling against the whole political system, setting themselves up for a demagogue to come by, anti-immigrant, the whole 9 yards. It was but it took, about 40 years for this to really, really ripen. I got to be honest with you. I didn't understand the degree of financialization until the crash of 2008, 2009. Yeah. I did, and even then it took me I started writing, I wrote a book about it, et cetera, et cetera. But even then I didn't understand the degree of runaway inequality that I also was sort of, I kept thinking, well, maybe they have figured out how to avoid recessions. Maybe they've figured something out here, that this monetary policy, I didn't understand that housing, that the derivative market was about turning in the world's largest casino that we were about to pay for the losses. I didn't understand that. So it wasn't like I was hungry to make a lot of money, and I still believed in public service, but I was, maybe they figured something out.
Well, to this day, we were told by Gordon Brown, who was then Chancellor, lauding the masters of the universe in the city. There's photographs of him in his tuxedo in the banqueting house. The end of boom and bust. So you weren't the only one. And to this day, there's so few people that I know of who actually understand what happened. You're an educator. There's a big job to do here. But just to put some scale on this, I know that at the beginning of this process, the multiplier between the average worker and the CEO was something like 30 to 1. So if I was the CEO and you were my average employee, I'd be earning, you might be earning $10,000 a year. I'd be earning 30 times that, which is pretty good. It's moved from there. What's it stand at today, Len?
Well, it's funny. This is how we start our workshops. We ask people. That's the first question we ask. And now on Zoom, you know, we have like they can fill out a little poll. We ask them what they think that wage gap is. For every dollar the average worker earns, how much does a top CEO, a top 100 CEO person earn? And you're right. It was about, 30, 40, 50 to 1 in 1970. And today it's the last decade, for the whole decade, 2010 to 2019, it's averaging 800 to 1. 800 to 1, actually 802 to 1. And it's really hard to wrap your mind around what that means. That means if you can afford one home, they can afford 802 homes. If you could send a child to college, they could send 802 to college. It becomes impossible to gather. Now, the other question we ask is we ask them what they think a fair and just gap ought to be. And there's some polling on this globally, actually, but I focus on the United States. In the United States, it turns out it's about 3-4 years old. So it might, maybe a little older than that. It might have changed now. It might have moved up. But a strong Democrat, strong liberal in the United States would say the gap should be about 5 to 1. A strong conservative Republican would say it should be about 12 to 1 for an average of 7 to 1. So when I ask, I think it's gone up. So I ask people, we give them another poll and say, what do you think it ought to be? And people are saying roughly somewhere around 10 to 20 to 1, 10 to 20 to 1. It's 800 to 1. They think it ought to be 10 or 20 to 1. So there's a sort of sense of justice and fairness that is being so violated now.
Yeah.
And that's hopeful, assuming we can help create a direction that isn't this xenophobic destructive direction that's rearing its ugly head all over the place now. Focusing somehow the immigrants are the problem, or multilateral arrangements with Europe or the States is the problem. That we all have to go into our nationalist shell to solve this problem. And in fact, it's runaway inequality. It's the financialization that we have to help people understand.
Yeah,
they don't go in this destructive direction.
And most people don't know that for the right now and for the last few years, all of the additional wealth created, all of it is not being shared. It's being taken, not by those who produced it, but by those who have engineered this system. What should we do about it?
Well, I want to take it one step further to give you a sense of how bad it's become. In the United States now, it's virtually open season on stealing the money wherever you can at the highest levels. So in today's New York Times, there's an article about how the Trump administration tipped off Wall Street that the COVID virus was going to be much more severe than it was telling the public, which led to the top hedge fund people going on a massive, shorting the market. The idea of self-dealing is now the norm. The public norm for stopping that is almost non-existent. People just assume everyone's going to steal. So the common good has been eroded. And I think the most important, you're interviewing me at an interesting time, because I'm having difficulty seeing past November 3rd, which is our election. Because somehow, if Donald Trump wins, the whole idea of the common good and democracy may be destroyed. We may not recover from that. Or if he tries to steal the election and do all the things a third world dictator might do, or a first world dictator might do. So it's really interesting. I haven't been able to get on the positive side of, what do we do to build a better world? I go back to some of the it's interesting at the end of these workshops, these online workshops that we're doing, which is the only way. I used to just travel all over the country. I can't do that now. So I'm traveling, through the wires that you understand, through the airwaves that you understand better than I do. And we asked them, well, there's a few steps to this. First of all, our two takeaways from our talks, just two. We say you can forget all the stuff I said up till now. Two takeaways. One, runaway inequality will not cure itself. That the whole idea of a sort of economic pendulum that goes from boom to bust, from more inequality, less inequality, that's gone. We're heading in one direction, increasing inequality day by day by day by day. So we're headed towards a world of ever-growing extreme inequality. So I say if that's true, which I believe it is, here's the second takeaway. We're going to have to build a very positive, very broad-based, very large movement to reverse runaway inequality. That's the key. So how do we do that? We have to come out of our issue silos, but one of the things we have to have is a common agenda, which I think is the question that you are asking. So we ask people what should be on the common agenda. And, there's some very obvious stuff, like people will say, in the States, for example, we need, a universal healthcare, which you have, which we don't. So we're like in the dark ages. I think you wouldn't believe what we're going through in terms of like how you pay your bills here and all it's just your medical bills, how crazy the system is. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got it. Okay. I've got to just bring up some more financialization stuff that's just come out. It's come out. There's three aspects of it. One is that nursing homes, which were ill prepared for a pandemic. One of the reasons is it's been a big hedge fund, private equity buyout. 80% of the nursing homes in the States are private. And by the way, Sweden went in that direction as well. And what happened is in the States is they split the nursing homes into two corporations. One owned the property in the building, that was high value. The other ran the nursing home, that was low value. And then the one would squeeze the other, and to try to reduce costs as much as possible, temporary workers, not enough equipment, long shifts, et cetera, and to suck the money out to give it to the corporation that owned the land and the building. That's what was going on when the pandemic hit. So there wasn't enough anything around. There weren't enough workers. There weren't enough protective equipment. Everything was being run down. Sweden just the other day admitted that that's what was going on also in their nursing homes, that they didn't, because they also were going to privatization of nursing homes and were also being cut down in terms of staffing, et cetera, to make profits. One. Two, the largest hospital chains, the 7 largest hospital chains in the United States, as the pandemic hit, the year before, 2019, made $35 billion in profits. Where'd the money go? 70% went to stock buybacks. So they also were squeezing their patients. Third example, this has just happened. Yesterday's newspaper had this one. Catch this. In the States, during COVID crisis, if you get sick, it's supposed to be covered, right? It's supposed to be covered. Hospitalization, the tests, et cetera, is supposed to be covered. Well, you know what's not covered? The air ambulance. So if one covered hospital says, we can't handle this person, they need to be sent over, they got to another hospital, and we're going to air vac them over to the other hospital. Guess who owns the unregulated helicopter? Private equity. And people are getting bills like $50,000 and it's not covered. The average cost of a medevac thing is $50,000. And they lobbied the government to make sure that they were not covered. They're not regulated by any of this other stuff. Anyway, that's what we're up against. So we have Medicare for all is one thing. We have another one, free higher education is another one, because students there's more credit card debt in the United States. Talk about financialization of families. There's more student loan debt in the United States than there is credit card debt.
Yeah.
That's how bad it is here. And then, but the one that's gaining the most traction in the States, that's coming up now, that never came up 5, 6, 7 years ago, is that everyone in the States should have a job, be able to have a job at a living wage.
Yeah.
That poverty is is so deep in the United States, and people are working full time and they're still below the poverty line. And I found out an interesting fact the other day that kind of blew my mind. The bottom 20% of the United States, 1 out of 5 people, and this is both black and white and brown, have 0 net worth, no wealth at all. 1 out of 5. And in every category in the United States, in every category, race, age, ethnicity, etc., the top 10% have at least 70% of the wealth.
Yeah. So
somehow we have to find a way to bring the bottom up. So that's healthcare, education, and a right to a job at a living wage. And then we have to bring the top down. And that's going to be wealth taxes, financial transaction taxes, something to slow down, inheritance taxes, which we've basically gotten rid of. Nothing's taxable up to $22 million. And there's all these fancy trusts and stuff like that exist to avoid taxes. Anyway, we have a lot of work to do to reverse runaway inequality.
We do. No one could live in 800 houses. Everyone needs a roof over their head. And I never thought I would live to see the world we've got here, where we've got steadily rising poverty. We've been doing some work on the poverty traps here. And we want to try and, we're trying to work to re-engineer some of them out. But we've got, before COVID, we had 14 million out of around 60 million people, in or within sight of the poverty trap. And that's probably going to double. That's something like half the population.
That's crazy. Hey, let me give you a warning, though.
Richest countries in the world, as you say.
Let me give you a warning. Here's the other incredibly destructive thing that's been going on in the States. What we didn't see going on in the 1980s and 90s was the dark side of runaway inequality, the financialization, when the money was going to the top and looked like things were happening. There were all these people at the bottom that could not find work.
Yeah.
And they ended up in the criminal justice system. And what we did was we warehoused, well, let me give you some interesting, quick stats here. Study was done not that long ago on high school graduates, people that finished their schooling, they didn't drop out, they finished their schooling. How many of them were unemployed or underemployed, meaning they had part-time jobs, but they wanted full-time jobs? Half the African-American young people, 17 to 20 years old, were in that category. 35% of Hispanics and 33% of the Anglos. So it's a terrible, terrible problem.
Yeah.
In the 1960s, we had hundreds of programs to try to deal with that kind of problem. Now we don't have any, except one, prison. So the prison population in the United States went from, it was basically flat, both in percentage and from 1910 to 1980. And when runaway inequality hit, starting in 1980, the prison population shot up from roughly 100,000, 200,000 people to 2 million. The line goes straight up. The line looks exactly like the wealth gap. It just shoots straight up. Today, the United States has of the developed nations, the most prisoners in the entire world, both in absolute number and in percentage of the population. We lead the world. Now, that's my warning to you guys, because if you if you criminalize poverty, right? If you keep people poor and on there, look, in a way, the best and the brightest are going to find criminal activities because they're going to want to, they want to put their talents to use. Yeah. As one professor friend of mine put it, he goes, the Americans have a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. It's just some of that's going to be illicit if you keep them out of your economy. And the danger is going to be that we're going to criminalize the poor and start and keep increasing the size of our prison population. To me, this has to change. And you can't just change it by saying, oh, we're going to stop putting people in prison. No, you have to actually, not only do you have to decriminalize a lot of these activities, especially around drugs, but you have to actually have meaningful work for people to do. And we have look around us now. COVID, as you said, highlights all the essential services that we need and all the things we need to do to make the climate safe and provide education and care for people and housing and all these kinds of things. But it requires a public intervention on a large scale. Yeah. And getting from here to there is going to take a lot of work because people are so suspicious of the government being able to do anything.
Yeah. Let me ask you a final question, and then at the end, I'll invite you to, leave us with whichever thought you'd like to. But this question, I've spent a lot of the last 10 years working on the sort of basis of crowdfunding and bringing it and nurturing it and helping it become established and the whole thing around the innovation unit here in the UK and so on. And one of the most interesting things is that there's almost zero fraud. And one of the things that everyone all the time used to ask me about is, well, it's only a matter of time. It's all going to go pop. It's, there'll be a scandal and it'll die. It hasn't. There hasn't been. There's almost the amount of fraud and malfeasance is so low. It's hard to measure. And that's very different to the traditional economy. And to answer the question why, a friend of mine, Professor Douglas Cummings, who has written a book on crowdfunding, amongst other things, looked at deterrence and found, there's a great study on this, and found that the opinion of peers was a far more powerful deterrent than the threat of prison. And I can't help thinking that going back to pre-Friedman, let's say, the kind of things that go on now, and as we said earlier, have been normalized, would have been utterly shocking and would have resulted in ostracism at least. And I wonder, and I'd love to have your opinion on this, whether this is part of the change we need is in not just in our values and in repudiating some of the mistakes that we've made around Friedmanism and so on, but also someone said to me the other day, just why isn't it changing? Just about everyone's getting screwed, except for the 0.1%. Is part of the answer that we need to find a voice.
Well, I think that's exactly right. We spend a lot of time actually trying to help people see how much things have changed. So in terms of the dropping, the elimination of that peer pressure, things that were unheard of are now commonplace. So, the four that we stress. So, for example, now in the States, it's assumed if you want to go to college, you're supposed to go into debt. When in the 1960s, much of public education was free. Higher education was free. You didn't have to go into debt unless you went to a fancy private school. or what you'd call a public school, you didn't have to worry about that. A university that was public you didn't a summer job would cover your expenses. And so how did that happen? It became normal. How did it become normal to think that a public sector job is less valuable than a private sector job? How did it become normal to blame poverty on the poor? It's their fault. They're not picking themselves up by the bootstraps, rather than there aren't enough decent paying jobs around. So I'm a small fish, very small fish in a gigantic pond, bigger than the one that's behind me on the backdrop here. And but what I do is to try to I think the key is education. That here's what we're finding, that most people do not have anything close to the kind of overview you have. The world is a jumble. All these different issues hit them from different angles, and because it comes at them in so many different ways, they're prone to conspiracy theories to try to put it all together. Oh, it must be this. I hear like very intelligent people saying things like, the Chinese created the virus and on purpose sent it to the United States. It's like, because they're trying to make sense out of a confused world. Yeah. One of the things our educational process does, and thank goodness we have a fair number of people that are doing it, is to kind of provide an overview that puts the pieces together, clicks the pieces together. And we are seeing what makes this powerful, what keeps me going, is the feedback that we get about, the aha moment. Things are starting to click together. I can see now the driving force of runaway inequality, and I understand a little more about financialization. I can see how this issue and that issue and this issue are connected, and I can see what a broad movement looks like. We're actually trying to create now. We were trying to create an army of trainers, and in a way that became too difficult because unless you were in a organized trade union education program, you wouldn't, once we trained you as a trainer, you probably wouldn't be able to get an opportunity to train. So only a few select unions that are spending a lot of money on this training have we built a cadre of trainers. So now what we're trying to do is train a group of people, and we're calling them solidarity builders. That the idea is to build solidarity across these various issues around the theme of reversing runaway inequality. Are we going to be able to do enough in time? I can't worry about that. I know that the kind of stuff that you're trying to do, the kind of stuff we're trying to do, has to be tried. We have to try to do it. And I'm such a believer that if you provide education, good things will happen. And we do it, and people can challenge it. They can argue with us. It's not a top-down process. But if you give them a chance to grapple with this stuff, good things happen. And I'm pretty hopeful of. Can we do enough of it? I'm a little less hopeful on that because we're such a small operation. Maybe you guys can show us how to do it.
Well, I think we need to come together across those silos you were talking about before, because we found a common root. You found it, we found it, and whether it's global warming, because we don't value what we're doing to the planet, the negative value of what we're doing to the planet, and avoid doing that, or all the other areas that you've mentioned. I was really interesting that literally in the last few days, David Attenborough has come out and actually made that connection as well, that it's the excesses of capitalism that have to now be recognized and curbed. So maybe we're making some progress. There is urgency to this, but at least now we're talking about it, and we're looking towards a COVID spring. Maybe we'll make it because we've got to, but in any case, it's been fascinating talking to you, Les. I'm so grateful to you for your work, and I'm going to mention Runaway Inequality, the book again, so that people can go and look and see how these mechanisms work, and all of the evidence that you've put together there. So, but you know, we have to remain hopeful, but thank you for your contribution, and let's keep on together.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.